So here we are, Section 7, the War of 1812. Some background on this. Madison chooses to abandon the policy of isolationism. At his request, Congress declares war on Great Britain in July of 1812. This is a bold step for the United States. They have a standing army of 7,000 poorly trained men, and their Navy is minuscule compared to the Royal British Navy. The U.S. Navy has 16 ships, larger warships within their Navy at their disposal. The Warhawks, remember Clay and Calhoun, they're excited about the prospect of marching into Canada and having the ability to expand U.S. territory to the north. The battles on land and sea. Both American and British forces found the going was tough. They both kind of felt they'd be able to come in and get an easy victory, and both found it was really tougher than they expected it to be. The Americans, 3 times they tried to push into Canada, and 3 times they were pushed back, 1812, 1813, and 1814. It just wasn't something the Canadians and the British living there were interested in doing, giving up that territory. Here we have a map of major battles, cities, and ports. You see there's a lot of activity on the Great Lakes and on the coast. Not too much is going on more to the interior. The British Navy experiences heavy losses to an undermanned American Navy, and a guy by the name of Oliver Hazard Perry really distinguishes himself as a war hero during the War of 1812. He successfully defeats the British on Lake Erie, and we see a common portrait here used. Fighting on the side of the British, Chief Tecumseh is killed in battle at the Battle of the Thames. It's a heavy loss, not only to the British but to the Native Americans. He had aligned his native nation, so to speak, on the side of the British because he knew that should the British come out victorious, they were more likely than the Americans just to kind of leave them alone and let them have a chunk of territory and be able to do with it what they will. And then we also have Napoleon's defeat in 1814, which allows the British to send more troops to North America. So we've touched on this several times, that nonlinear study of history, understanding that when one event is occurring, there's been cause and effect to bring that event to fruition. His empire in Europe expanded as far as it was going to go. Britain played a major role in his defeat, and they were able to take those forces, which they had committed to stopping his expansion in Europe, and send them over to the United States. So Napoleon goes down, he's exiled, and that's more of I guess, a world history topic, but so Britain's able to commit more troops, more resources, more ships to their navy to the war against the United States. August 1814, British forces invade Washington, D.C. They burn down several buildings, including the White House. Madison is forced to flee for his life. And then in September of 1814, they attack the port city of Baltimore, and they have the bombardment of Fort McHenry. And we know the story. Francis Scott Key watches the bombardment. When he wakes up in the morning, he's thrilled to see that the American flag is still flying, so he knows that the British have not overtaken the fort. And to express his gratitude, he writes a poem which later becomes our national anthem. The Battle of New Orleans. Prior to the attack on Baltimore, a separate British fleet surrendered after the Battle of Lake Champlain in New York. This defeat on Lake Champlain basically breaks the British spirit. They don't want to be involved with it anymore. Due to the slow travel of news, though, British commanders decided to launch an attack on New Orleans. They weren't aware of the defeat on Lake Champlain or that the fact that the British wanted to withdraw from the war. So January 1815, 7,500 British troops were met by 7,000 militia, led by Andrew Jackson. 2,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded compared to 70 Americans. Though unnecessary, the Battle of New Orleans was the greatest American victory of the war. 2 weeks prior to the battle, U.S. and British diplomats signed a peace treaty in Ghent, Belgium. Results of the war then. Both sides claimed victory to a war that neither really won. The treaty didn't settle any pre-war issues. The problems of impressment and ship seizure basically faded away as Europe settled into a peaceful time period. The effects of the war. The Native American resistance was severely weakened in the Northwest Territories, so we see greater expansion, a greater push west of the American frontier. National pride in America surged. Many considered the war to be a second war for independence. And the Federalist Party, still reeling from Adams' defeat, never really covered from opposing the war. Remember, the Federalists were opposed to going to war with Britain. And then 2 war heroes, William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, would later be elected president. So we'll talk to you next time, and we'll look at how these events kind of push into Monroe's dilemma and what he's going to do to solve his dilemma of keeping Europe out of the Western Hemisphere.